It was a cold, biting evening when Thomas Bradley first laid eyes on the Montauk Mansion. The sun, hidden behind heavy clouds, left a gray haze over the landscape, casting long shadows across the leafless trees. He stood at the edge of the driveway, the rusted gates creaking as the wind howled through them. Before him, the sprawling estate rose like a blackened skeleton, its once grand walls now decayed and weathered. Ivy crawled up the stone, gripping the building like a parasite, slowly choking the life from its host. Thomas was no stranger to strange places, but this one unnerved him. The stories had intrigued him at first, rumors of secret government projects, whisperings of disappearances. He'd read about the Montauk Project, a supposed series of clandestine experiments linked to mind control, time travel, and other bizarre phenomena. But Thomas wasn't here to satisfy idle curiosity. He had come searching for something personal. His brother, John, had vanished after mentioning his plans to investigate the mansion, and now, 2 weeks later, there had been no word from him. He had to know what happened. Steeling his nerves, Thomas pushed through the iron gates, their protest echoing in the empty air. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the mansion. The towering structure seemed to loom larger the closer he got, its windows like black, empty eyes staring into his soul. There was no warmth in this place, no sign of life. Just the steady rhythm of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. At the massive oak doors, he hesitated. His breath came in short, nervous bursts, and his pulse quickened. There was something about the place, something unseen, that made his skin crawl. But Thomas was not one to give in to fear easily. With a deep breath, he reached for the tarnished brass handle, pulling the door open with a groaning creak. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Dust particles danced in the dim light that filtered through cracked windows, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The mansion's once luxurious interior was in ruins. Tattered curtains hung limply from the windows, and the faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls. But it wasn't just the decay that unnerved him, it was the oppressive silence that followed his every move. As he ventured deeper, Thomas noticed the odd sensation of being watched. His every step seemed accompanied by the feeling of unseen eyes tracking him through the dim hallways. He glanced over his shoulder frequently, certain he'd catch a glimpse of movement, but there was never anything there. Just empty corridors and abandoned rooms. And yet, something felt terribly wrong. He found himself drawn to a grand staircase in the center of the mansion, its wooden steps leading up to the second floor. As he ascended, the creaking beneath his feet grew louder, as if the house were groaning in protest of his presence. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. The air was even colder here, sending a shiver down his spine. One door, at the far end of the hall, stood slightly ajar. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the half-open door. Something about it unsettled him, but he couldn't turn back now. He had come this far, and whatever had happened to his brother, the answers had to be here. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door fully open. Inside, the room was nearly empty, save for a single desk placed against the far wall. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and the air was musty, but something on the desk caught his eye. Moving closer, he saw it was a journal, John's journal. He picked it up, flipping through the pages quickly. Most of it was filled with his brother's scrawling handwriting, recounting his journey into the mansion and the strange occurrences he had witnessed. But as Thomas reached the last few entries, his blood ran cold. The words became erratic, desperate. John had written about feeling watched, about seeing lights in the woods at night, about hearing voices calling his name from the shadows. The final entry was dated 2 days before John's disappearance. It reads simply, "There is something in this house. I don't know what it is, but it's watching me. It's coming for me. I can feel it. I have to leave. But it's too late." A cold sweat broke out across Thomas's skin. As he held the journal, a faint noise reached his ears, a whisper, low and indistinct, but unmistakably real. He spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the silence, deep and consuming. But the whisper came again, this time louder, and it was unmistakable now. It was his brother's voice, calling his name. Thomas. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His brother's voice, soft, familiar, echoed through the empty room. He stood frozen, clutching the journal tightly to his chest, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the room remained still, thick with silence, save for the persistent pounding of his heart. "Thomas," the voice came again, clearer this time, tinged with desperation. He swallowed hard, every instinct screaming for him to run. But he couldn't. He needed to know if John was still here. Something had happened to his brother in this mansion, and whatever it was, Thomas had to confront it. He took a tentative step forward, moving toward the door where the voice had seemed to emanate from. The hallway beyond was just as he'd left it, silent, suffocating. The faded wallpaper clung to the walls like old skin, and the few doors that lined the corridor remained tightly shut. The air, however, felt heavier, colder. Thomas could feel it pressing down on him, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. He whispered his brother's name, hoping against hope that he would hear a response. Nothing. But then, just as he was about to turn back, the faintest flicker of light caught his eye. It came from down the hall, from a room Thomas hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, and from within, a pale glow pulsed faintly, as though a candle burned in the distance. Without thinking, Thomas walked toward it, drawn by the inexplicable allure of the light. As he neared, the glow intensified. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the door, slowly pushing it open. The creak of the hinges cut through the stillness, and Thomas stepped inside. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture draped in dusty sheets, but in the center, a strange apparatus caught his eye. It looked like a series of old, rusted machines connected by frayed wires, haphazardly strewn about the floor. At the heart of the setup was a large, metallic chair that resembled something out of a nightmare, a relic of twisted experimentation. The light emanated from above, where a single, bare bulb flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Thomas's gaze lingered on the chair, a deep unease twisting his gut. What had they done here? What had his brother stumbled upon? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the mansion, shaking the walls and reverberating through the floors. Thomas jumped, heart racing, as the door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the old wood. His pulse quickened as he rushed to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped. "John," he shouted, pounding his fists against the door. "John, are you here?" For a moment, only silence answered. Then, a scraping noise, low and guttural, drifted from behind him. Thomas spun around, eyes wide with terror, as the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to ripple and shift. Something was moving. At first, it was just a vague shape, indistinct, like a trick of the light. But then, as the seconds passed, the shape grew clearer, more defined. It was a figure, a tall, hunched figure emerging from the darkness. Its limbs were twisted, unnaturally elongated, and its eyes, black, hollow pits fixed on him with a malevolent intensity. Thomas stumbled backward, pressing himself against the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure moved slowly, methodically, its bony fingers scraping along the floor as it approached. The air grew impossibly cold, and Thomas could see his breath in the dim light, each exhale a puff of white mist. Thomas, the voice again, John's voice, though it now sounded distorted, wrong. "Stay away!" Thomas screamed, desperation clawing at his throat as he scrambled to find something, anything, he could use to defend himself. His hands found a rusted iron rod lying on the floor, and he gripped it tightly, holding it in front of him like a weapon. The figure paused, its head tilting to one side as if studying him. Then, with a sudden, horrifying speed, it lunged. Thomas swung the rod, striking the figure square in the chest. There was no sound of impact, no resistance. The figure simply passed through him like a gust of icy wind. A bone-deep chill flooded Thomas's body as the entity's shadowy form enveloped him, a cold so intense it numbed his senses. His vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to distort, twisting, stretching, before snapping back into focus. He found himself on the floor, gasping for breath, the rod still clutched in his trembling hands. The figure was gone, vanished into the shadows from whence it came. But the room felt different now. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Thomas staggered to his feet, shaking with adrenaline. He had to get out, now. Rushing to the door, he tried the handle again, and this time, it gave way. The door creaked open, and Thomas stumbled out into the hallway, his mind reeling from the encounter. He had barely taken a few steps when he heard it again, the whisper, soft and insistent. "Thomas." He froze, his blood turning to ice. It wasn't coming from the room behind him. It was coming from upstairs. The whisper echoed through the corridor, sending a shiver down Thomas's spine. His legs felt like lead, but something compelled him to move toward the staircase. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave, to abandon this cursed mansion and never look back. But the pull of John's voice was too strong. It dragged him forward, step by agonizing step. The stairs groaned beneath his weight as he ascended. The air grew denser, the temperature dropping with each step. As he reached the top, the dim light from below faded into an oppressive darkness, only broken by slivers of moonlight that seeped through cracks in the decaying walls. Ahead, a long hallway stretched into the void, lined with old portraits. The faces in the frames were warped, almost grotesque, their eyes seeming to follow his every movement. He gripped the iron rod tighter, his knuckles white from the force. Something was wrong here, he could feel it in his bones. The mansion itself seemed alive, watching, waiting. At the end of the hallway stood a door, slightly ajar, just like the one downstairs. A faint light flickered from within, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. Thomas approached cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. The closer he got, the more the air around him seemed to hum with energy, an unseen force pressing against his skin. Just as his hand reached for the door, it swung open violently, as if pulled by an invisible force. Thomas stumbled back, the rod raised defensively, but the room beyond was empty. No shadowy figures, no twisted shapes, just a large, circular chamber filled with old books and strange equipment, much like the room below. But this one felt different. The air here buzzed with a palpable tension, like the moment before a lightning strike. In the center of the room was a massive table covered in yellowed papers, maps, and strange blueprints. At its center sat a small, metal box, sealed tight, with no visible lock. Thomas's eyes were drawn to it, as though it held the answer to everything that had happened here. His gut twisted in warning. but his curiosity overpowered his fear. As he stepped closer, he noticed something strange, an old photograph, half buried under the papers. He pulled it free and stared in shock. It was a picture of him and John, taken just a few months before John disappeared. But there was something wrong. Behind them, barely visible, was the outline of the mansion, Montauk. How could this be? They'd never been here before. A soft, rhythmic tapping filled the room, and Thomas whipped around, searching for the source of the sound. His eyes darted toward the far corner, where an old wooden chair sat facing the wall. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The chair began to rock, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity, creaking with each movement. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as the chair suddenly jerked violently, slamming against the floor. He took a step back, muscles tensing as a figure began to materialize in the shadows, seated in the rocking chair. It was John, but not the John he remembered. His brother's face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His skin seemed translucent, stretched too thin over his bones. And his eyes, those lifeless, black pits, locked onto Thomas with a predatory intensity. "John?" Thomas whispered, voice trembling. John said nothing, but his lips twisted into a grotesque smile that sent a wave of nausea through Thomas. His body seemed to convulse, twitching unnaturally, as if something inside him was struggling to get out. Then, without warning, John stood, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet on strings. The air around Thomas grew colder still, and a sharp pain shot through his head, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, John was gone, the chair still rocking in the corner. Thomas's heart raced as he backed away, his mind reeling. What was happening here? What had they done to his brother? Before he could gather his thoughts, a deep, guttural growl rumbled from behind him. Slowly, he turned, and his blood ran cold. The box on the table had opened, and from within, a black, viscous substance was oozing out, spreading across the surface like a living thing. It pulsed and writhed, tendrils of darkness reaching toward him. He stumbled back, horrified, but the shadows were quick, slithering toward him with unnatural speed. Panicking, Thomas swung the iron rod at the tendrils, but it passed through them without resistance. The darkness coiled around his legs, cold and sticky, pulling him toward the table. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but the shadows only tightened their grip, dragging him closer and closer to the pulsing black mass. Just as he felt the darkness begin to creep up his chest, there was a sudden flash of blinding light. The room shuddered violently, the shadows recoiling as if in pain. For a brief moment, everything went still. Then, the light faded, and Thomas found himself standing in the middle of the room, gasping for air. The shadows were gone, the box sealed shut once more. But something had changed. The room no longer felt empty. He could feel them, watching. Eyes, dozens of them, hidden in the corners of the room, just out of sight. He could hear their whispers, too, faint but growing louder with each passing second. "Leave," they hissed in unison. "Before it's too late." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted for the door, heart pounding in his ears. As he raced down the hallway, the whispers followed him, growing more frantic, more desperate. But the mansion wouldn't let him go so easily. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing thicker with each step. The stairs loomed ahead, but as Thomas reached them, the floor beneath him shifted, and he was sent tumbling down, crashing into the darkness below. Thomas's body slammed against the ground at the bottom of the stairs, his breath knocked from his lungs. He lay there, gasping for air, pain radiating from his side where he had landed on the cold, hard floor. His ears rang, and for a few moments, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Slowly, the ringing subsided, replaced by a low hum that reverberated through the walls of the mansion. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, almost as if the house itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with him. He forced himself to stand, clutching his side, the iron rod still clutched in his trembling hand. He was back in the main hallway, but everything felt different. The atmosphere had shifted. The air was heavier, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to writhe with anticipation. The whispers were gone, but in their place, there was something far worse, a deep, oppressive silence. The kind that hung thick in the air, pressing in on him from all sides. Thomas staggered forward, desperate to find an exit, his mind racing with fear. The front door was his only hope. If he could make it outside, maybe he could outrun whatever haunted this place. Maybe he could escape the grasp of Montauk Mansion. But as he turned toward the front of the house, his stomach dropped. The hallway had changed. The once familiar corridor now stretched impossibly long, bending in unnatural angles, twisting into a maze of warped architecture. Doors appeared where there had been none before, each one slightly ajar, beckoning him to open them. He glanced behind him, only to find that the stairs had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. There was no going back. His heart sank as the realization hit him. He was trapped. The hum in the walls grew louder, almost a growl now, vibrating through the floor beneath his feet. Thomas had no choice. He had to move, had to keep going. The longer he stood still, the more he felt the house closing in around him, as though it were hungry, waiting for him to fall into its trap. He moved toward the first door on his left, the closest one, hesitating for only a second before pushing it open. The door creaked on its hinges, and the smell of rot hit him like a wall. He gagged, covering his nose and mouth as he stepped into the room. It was a small chamber, barely furnished, with a single window that looked out onto the fog-covered grounds of the mansion. But what drew his attention was the figure standing in the corner. A man, or what remained of one, stood motionless, his back to Thomas. His clothes were tattered, skin pale and translucent, veins pulsing beneath the surface. His head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and from his hunched posture, it was clear something had broken him long before Thomas arrived. The man muttered softly to himself, words that Thomas couldn't make out. As Thomas took a step back, the man's head jerked unnaturally, turning halfway to reveal a face that was twisted in pain. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared right through Thomas. "No. No more," the man whispered, voice trembling with terror. "It's coming. It's always coming." Before Thomas could react, the man collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. He was dead, but his words echoed in Thomas's ears. "It's coming." Without another thought, Thomas turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. His heart raced as he stumbled through the twisting hallway, every door he passed seeming to open just a little wider, shadows spilling out from within. The humming in the walls intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl. Something was moving in the dark, something unseen but undeniably present. He could feel it now, watching him, hunting him. His breath came in short, frantic bursts as he ran, trying to find a way out, any way out. Suddenly, the floor beneath him shifted again, but this time it didn't collapse. Instead, it rippled, as though the ground itself were alive, moving beneath his feet. He stumbled but managed to keep his balance, his eyes darting around for some clue, some indication of how to escape this nightmare. The hallway led him to another staircase, but this one was different. It spiraled downward, deeper into the mansion, into the very bowels of the structure. A cold draft wafted up from the bottom, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Thomas hesitated at the top, his instincts screaming at him not to descend any further. But the growling behind him left him no choice. He had to keep moving. Clutching the iron rod tightly, Thomas began his descent. Each step creaked underfoot, echoing through the narrow passage as the staircase spiraled deeper and deeper into the heart of the mansion. The darkness seemed thicker here, oppressive, and his flashlight flickered weakly, barely cutting through the inky blackness ahead. As he descended, strange symbols appeared on the walls, glowing faintly in the dark. They pulsed with an eerie light, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that made Thomas's skin crawl. The hum was louder now, almost deafening, vibrating through the very bones of the mansion. And then, the growl. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from below. Thomas stopped, every instinct telling him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know what was down there, what had happened to John, what this house was hiding. He had come too far to turn back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended. Thomas found himself standing at the entrance to a massive underground chamber, the air thick with the stench of damp earth and decay. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, and in the center of the room, there was a large, circular stone altar, covered in dried blood. And standing before it, waiting for him, was John. But this time, there was no mistaking it. This wasn't his brother. Not anymore. The thing that had taken his brother's form turned to face him, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Its smile stretched too wide, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light of the chamber. It raised one hand, and the walls of the chamber trembled as the growl intensified, reverberating through the stone. Thomas's grip tightened on the iron rod as he stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what this thing was, but he knew one thing for sure: it wasn't going to let him leave alive. The walls were breathing. Thomas staggered through the hallway, watching the wooden panels swell and contract like a living organism. His vision blurred at the edges, and he fought to keep his mind anchored in the present, but the mansion seemed determined to pull him into something far darker. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic noise echoed through the hall, like the clank of heavy chains. Thomas turned sharply, searching the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. He had been walking in circles for what felt like hours. Every time he passed through the same intersection of doors, the symbols carved into the walls seemed to shift slightly, as though mocking him for his confusion. His body ached from exhaustion, but giving up wasn't an option. Somewhere in this twisted labyrinth was the answer to John's disappearance. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the rough texture of dried blood on his palms from scraping at the door earlier. His mind kept drifting back to the memory of John, laughing, his voice clear in Thomas's head despite the growing fog of terror. They had shared so much, and now, there was only silence. A thud reverberated from the floor beneath him. Thomas froze. The sound repeated, louder, closer. It felt like something heavy was moving below, dragging itself through the belly of the mansion. Then, as if to confirm his growing suspicion, the floorboards trembled beneath his feet. "John?" Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse. There was no reply. But in the silence that followed, he thought he could hear the faintest murmuring. Whispers. And they weren't his. The air around him grew thick and oppressive. His breath came in short gasps as he looked down to see the floor shifting beneath him. Black tendrils, almost like roots, began creeping up the walls, twisting in unnatural patterns, forming letters he couldn't read but could somehow feel deep in his bones. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to pulse with life now, each one resonating with the sound of distant, agonized screams. Thomas's eyes darted to the end of the hallway. There was a door he hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, the faint light spilling out from it casting long shadows on the floor. Something was drawing him toward it. The mansion wants me to open it. He hesitated for just a moment, but the pull was undeniable. Whatever was behind that door held the answers. The door creaked as Thomas pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. A putrid stench hit him immediately, the unmistakable scent of decay. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to take the first step down. Then the next. With every footfall, the air grew heavier, and the whispers became louder, more insistent, almost as if they were directly inside his skull. The staircase opened into a large, cavernous room that was dimly illuminated by flickering light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a large metal table, and strapped to it was John. John! Thomas sprinted forward, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he approached, he saw the truth. His brother's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The skin on his face was pale, almost translucent, with strange patterns carved into his flesh. Tubes and wires connected his body to a series of grotesque machines that hummed with an eerie life of their own. Thomas fell to his knees beside the table. John, no! Suddenly, John's body jerked, his head twisting unnaturally toward Thomas. His eyes, once warm and familiar, were now filled with something far colder. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out was not his own. You should have left, Thomas, the voice rasped. But now, you're part of this. Thomas stumbled backward, horror gripping his heart. The machines began to roar louder, the room filling with an electric hum. The shadows around him shifted, forming dark figures with hollow eyes, watching him from every corner. John, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Thomas screamed. He felt the walls closing in around him, the room growing impossibly tight. The whispers became deafening, pounding against his skull like a sledgehammer. Then, as if responding to his terror, the lights flickered and died. The room plunged into total darkness. When Thomas opened his eyes, he was no longer in the underground room. He was back in the grand hall of the mansion, standing in front of the massive fireplace. The house was eerily silent, as if it had swallowed everything that had just happened. He looked down at his hands, still trembling, and realized that the symbols, the same ones carved into the walls, were now etched into his skin. He stumbled forward, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had any of it been real? Or had the mansion driven him mad? But then, something changed. Thomas felt a pull deep within his chest. The mansion was alive, and now it was in him. He could hear it whispering, the same whispers that had tormented him since the moment he arrived. And worse, he could feel the presence of John, not as a ghost, but as something embedded in the walls. Thomas turned slowly, his gaze falling on a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. The eyes staring back were hollow, devoid of life. A twisted, mocking version of himself. You were never meant to leave, the voice said from behind him. But when Thomas spun around, there was no one there. Only the mansion, silent, patient. He tried to run for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed, the walls closing in. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the walls, screaming, but his voice was swallowed by the mansion's endless corridors. And then, he felt it, a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned and saw John, standing beside him, his face twisted in agony. We're part of this now, John whispered, his voice barely audible. The mansion doesn't let anyone leave. Thomas felt the truth sinking in like a blade through his chest. The Montauk Mansion had taken him, just as it had taken John. And it would take more, as it always had. As the final light flickered out, the last thing Thomas saw was the door slowly creaking open, welcoming its next victim. And thus, the cycle continued. The mansion waited patiently for the next lost soul to wander in, unaware that once inside, there would be no escape. Only whispers in the dark, and a fate worse than death.